Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipson. Today's guest is Stephen Taylor Heath, the partner and head of sports law at JMW Solicitors. Stephen has been in the sports business for almost 30 years and has experiences from working with football clubs, agents, promoters, boxers, and much more. Recently, he has been involved with some very interesting projects, like the NFT Ukraine project and Modest Golf Management, co-founded by pop star Niall Horan. More about this, Stephen's journey through sport, and much more, coming right up. Stephen Taylor Heath, welcome to Sports Management Podcast.
Good afternoon, Marcus.
So you are a partner and the head of sports law at the JMW Solicitors. So can you tell us a little bit about your role?
Yes, thank you. I'm head of sports law at JMW, which means I head up a team of lawyers. JMW has 3 offices, Liverpool, Manchester and London. I'm a specialist sports lawyer, as it were, so I mainly focus on servicing sports clients, but our sports team has lawyers in various different departments like intellectual property, employment, matrimonial, property and the like, who look after clients in the sports sector. So we outward facing are a sports team, but we're not all, as it were, just purely sports lawyers. So I've been a lawyer since 1993. I've been carrying out sports law related matters since about 1995. My first case was before the British Boxing Board of Control for a former world champion boxer called Joe Calzaghe. And really, I've been doing this type of work ever since.
That's great. You said that you have done some law work also outside of sports. And I've had some other sports lawyers on previously, and they say that employment law is the one that they feel have benefited the most. Would you agree with that?
I would. It can be misinterpreted when you say I'm a sports lawyer. The question is, what does that mean in relation to what's your specialization? And of course, athletes are people, and the owners of sports clubs are companies. So they're subject to company law. They're subject to regulatory law. People have the same personal issues as everybody else. And where it is more specialist is really in relation to the regulation. So each sport has a governing body and it has its own disciplinary framework, for example, and it has rules and regulations that are specific to that particular sport. So if you are going to advise clients that are operating in that sector, you need to understand those rules and regulations. And if you go to a disciplinary, for example, before a particular governing body, that disciplinary panel and the procedure will not be the same as if you appear in a court of law, for example. So the fact that you've trained to be a litigator wouldn't necessarily mean that you can deal with a dispute that's before a particular governing body. So you need to understand those particular regulations to advise in relation to that. But as you say, what can be lost sometimes is that if you've got a footballer who is employed by a football club, then he's employed under an employment contract. And so employment law does apply to him. And you can't have a rule and regulation that is in breach of the natural law of the land, whichever country you're in.
Yes, that's a good point. And yeah, you alluded to it that there are different regulations in different sports, and you are working in a wide variety of sports, for example, football, racing, boxing.
Yes.
So what is it that can differ mostly between the different sports?
Well, certainly boxing is quite unique in many respects. Obviously, I've been over to Las Vegas for a few world title fights in my time and what have you. And in boxing, you have different world championships. You have 4 or 5 world titles, governing bodies. They set their own rules and regulations. And then in England, you have the British Boxing Board of Control, which sets their rules and regulations. In America, for example, you have state athletic commissions, and each state has its own athletic commission, has its own set of rules and regulations. So when you're dealing with a boxing type matter, you have to take all of these different regulations into consideration, and the fact that each governing body will have its own rules. And boxing is run on quite a traditional way in many respects. And the British Boxing Board of Control have their own contracts and they have their own licensing system. So if you want to operate in boxing, in an official capacity as a manager or a promoter or a trainer, then you have to be licensed by them, which means that firstly, you have to meet their criteria. And secondly, you are subject to their rules and regulations. So you would need to have an understanding of those particular areas in order to advise clients in that sector. Then, of course, you've got football and you have the different governing bodies in football who all are setting their own rules and regulations. And if you're advising a footballer, a professional footballer at the top level on a commercial level, so you're advising him in relation to his sponsorship agreements and things like that, then you have to look at the commitments that he's got to his team and potentially to his national team. And then he has his own individual sponsors as well. So you can imagine that there's quite a pyramid of rules and regulations that you have to consider. And dare I say it, Marcus, that not all sports are regulated equally. So what we have in England is there is a greater degree now of proper regulation of sport, because a lot of sports, unlike football and rugby to a certain extent, are very dependent on government money. And the government will only invest that money if the governing body meets certain standards of regulation. So that is a good thing, because it means that particular sports are hopefully being run properly by the governing body, and the governing body can afford to do that because it takes money to regulate. It takes money to have a disciplinary procedure. It takes money to investigate matters. So the money comes in for the regulation, but in order to get that money to fund that regulation, you basically need to be producing athletes that are competing well at, say, the Olympics or internationally.
Yeah. If you're talking about boxing, you have worked, quite a bit in boxing. You are also the general counsel for Box Nation, and you have worked for the Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder fight. So what is it that you work with that?
Yeah, I have worked with Box Nation. I have worked with for many years with the boxing promoter Frank Warren, who is a promoter of Tyson Fury. I haven't worked personally for Tyson Fury, but each boxer obviously has a promoter, and that promoter is in charge of organising the boxers' fights. The promoter also liaises with the broadcasters and organises the events. So the lawyer's job is to deal with contracts between the promoter and the boxers that they promote. It's the broadcasting agreements for the fights that take place. And obviously it's all contracts in relation to the promotion of the events, which is the staging of the events, which could be a venue contract, and security matters and things like that. And also the sponsorship of the particular events. Each particular event has key sponsorship, but the boxers themselves also have sponsorship as well. So we've worked with particular high profile boxers in relation to their sponsorship contracts as well. And in relation to Tyson Fury and the fighters that he's faced, such as Deontay Wilder and what have you, then you would be dealing with potential agreements between the promoters, because obviously different boxers have different promoters. So depending on whether the fight is agreed between the promoters or it's what's called a purse bid, where any promoter can stage a bid subject to qualifying, meeting the criteria to stage the fight. So there are various agreements between promoters in relation to particular fights.
You're also working on some very interesting projects, and you oversaw one that was NFT Ukraine project.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
We were asked to get involved in relation to the legal work for pitching for Ukraine, and that is the creation of an NFT, the proceeds for which will go to good causes in Ukraine. The NFT itself, you're probably aware of what NFTs are now, so I won't go into great detail about what them, but obviously it's a unique piece of memorabilia which is created, which uses part of the intellectual property of the Ukrainian football clubs. So, for example, Shakhtar Donetsk, their image rights. And so you have to acquire those rights from the club, which are then integrated into the NFT to create the NFT. You then have to have a platform to sell the NFT. So you have an agreement with the club to acquire the rights to create the NFT. Then you have a platform agreement to sell the NFT. And then you need to have a means for the proceeds from the sale of the NFT finding its way to the good causes in Ukraine. And in this particular instance, we used a fiscal sponsor that was set up by President Zelensky to enable the transfer of the funds. So you need agreements with the platform, and then you need an agreement with the fiscal sponsor to transfer the monies to the good causes. So we did the legal work for that.
That's fantastic. And when it says that you oversee, what were your role?
Well, that means the contracts, making sure the contracts are correct. It's obviously for a good cause and what have you, but you still need to make sure that everybody knows what their obligations are in relation to in the chain that I've just described to you. You need to make sure that the appropriate rights are, that you're not infringing anybody else's rights by doing this and by creating this. And you make sure that everybody knows what their role is to make sure that it happens. So our overseeing role was basically overseeing the contracts between the various parties.
Is it more common nowadays to do these type of projects with the NFT specifically?
Well, virtually every club now has joined the bandwagon in relation to creating their own NFTs. There is obviously a bit of mystique in relation to NFTs and what have you. And when you buy an NFT through what's called a smart contract, which is code that's embedded within the NFT. Now, that is an extremely specialist area, and it's something I don't do smart contracts. But if you take away the fact that it's an NFT, the legal principles that are involved are very much the same as a club providing its imagery and its rights to a sponsor who wants to be associated with the club. So if you've got a shirt sponsor or you've got a marquee sponsor of a club, that sponsor wants to acquire certain rights to use the club's imagery to promote themselves. And that it's the acquisition of that imagery and the sponsor agreement that is something that a sports lawyer deals with quite often for a sponsor or a club. And it's the acquisition of that imagery from the Ukrainian clubs that was important in relation to this. So whilst there is obviously some unique elements to a deal involving NFTs, there are some common principles to most deals as well. But yes, certainly the idea of NFTs and the idea of clubs using their imagery to create those NFTs is definitely a growth area.
Talking a little bit about JMW, the firm that you work for and are a partner at, they recently retained a ranking in the Tier 2 of sports law in the Northwest, and you were also ranked as a leading individual. What does this ranking mean?
Well, I'm pleased to say you can't vote for yourself, so I haven't awarded myself the leading individual role. So effectively, Legal 500 will interview your clients and they will ask you what type of work you're dealing with, and if they think that the type of workload that you're dealing with and the type of clients you've got and what your clients say about you merit you having this ranking, then you are given this ranking. So to be categorized as a leading individual, some of the other people in the leading individual bracket are people that sit on the Court of Arbitration for Sport and the like. So it's a pretty high quality field of people. So to be actually within that bracket is quite an honor, really. But it's the rankings in relation to the firm relates to the quality of the clients that you've got and the quality of the people that you've got. They go hand in hand, really. If you haven't got the people, then you won't get the clients. If you've got the clients, then people want to join you. So, if you want to build up a sports law practice, then if you've got some marquee clients, then it makes life a little bit easier, because quite a few people have an interest in sport, but they don't necessarily know what it involves, and they might want to have a career in sport, and they might not know what it entails. Showing my age, obviously, but when I qualified as a lawyer, you didn't study sports law when you were at university and what have you. You simply acquired an understanding of what it was in practice by acting for clients that are in the sports sector. Now, obviously the sports training marketplace has widened, and you can actually study sports law at university and have a better grounding of it before you actually become a lawyer. And I think that's very useful, obviously, because you have an understanding of it. But I might say this, wouldn't I? But effectively, there's no substitute for the experience of actually advising people in practice. I worked in-house for a while at Leeds United, which is a Premier League football club local to myself. And when you are in-house as well, and you're not just advising clients by phone or by email or by letter, but obviously your door's always open and your client is always there. And you never know what the next question is going to be that comes through the door. And so that is a steep learning curve, but is also an excellent way of learning as well. So it's important to have an understanding of the basic concepts that apply to sports law. So, for example, it would be good to have a grounding of the basic principles that would go into a sponsorship agreement, what have you. But until you actually deal with one, you can't anticipate what practical problems might come up. And your clients will not just expect you to advise on a sheet of paper as to what the law says. They'll want to know what the practical application of that is. And that mainly comes through experience.
Yeah, and experience you have. You mentioned that you started working in 1993, which is actually the year I was born. So you've been around and very experienced. And I'm very interested to see about how you started your career and how later you got into the sports sector. Well,
when I qualified, we had a system called Articles of Association, which is basically the same as your 2-year training contract. So you would obviously, you'd do the 3 years at university, you'd do the 1 year at law school, and then you'd do your 2 years training. But as I say, you didn't have a seat which within your training that would be sports, for example. So you would effectively acquire your grounding in the sports, firstly from obviously having an interest in the sport, but secondly, really in advising clients in that particular sector. So, as I say, if you were advising somebody that was involved in boxing, then you'd immediately have to go to the British Boxing Board of Control website and look at what their rules and regulations are. If you're advising somebody in football, then you need to go to the FA website and look at their rules and regulations. Now, their rules and regulations are about 600 pages long. You're not going to learn all of that, but you're going to want to know where to look. If you're going to advise somebody in athletics, then you're going to need to go to the governing body's athletics website and you're going to need to know what their procedures are. If you're doing a normal training contract, then, for example, if you're doing litigation, you will have a grounding in what your local court's procedures are. But you won't necessarily have a grounding in relation to dispute resolution in relation to a sports matter. And so you effectively, it's a bit chicken and egg to use that phrase, but effectively, if you're acting for people that are in the sports sector, then you get the experience and that enables you to be able to advise other people. So you really need to try and find a firm that does have lawyers that are practicing in that area and that you can learn from and be exposed to those types of work. It's very difficult just to learn it from a theory-based education by just doing it as a module in law school.
Yeah, so one of my questions are usually, what is your best advice for young people who wants to take a similar career path as you do? So obviously you need to be a lawyer, but also I understand from you that like taking an internship or just, do the work.
Yeah, exposure is the key. As I say, it's not a traditional area of the law, which most traditional law firms do. And I wouldn't be able to advise on traditional areas of the law, but equally a traditional lawyer couldn't probably advise on the areas that I can advise on. So if you want to operate in this particular area, then, as I say, you want to try and learn with a firm that does have a sports or a media department as well. There's always a crossover between sports and media. I do an awful lot of contract for sports people now that effectively the sponsor doesn't just want them to turn up to a golf day or something like that. They want them to have social media presence, and you need to be very careful what that social media presence is, how often it is and what have you. And that crosses over into the media and the world of influencers and people like that. So if you join a firm that has that media or sports offering, then you will get exposure to this area. And obviously, it's always quite difficult to learn on the job. But I say that caution is the best policy. And if you're not 100% sure about the answer, you should always check with somebody, because you won't be criticised for asking difficult questions. You would be criticised for going ahead without having asked those questions. So I think caution is always the best policy, especially in an area like this, where the politics of sport is almost as important as the laws themselves.
Yeah, it's specifically important in the field of law to take caution.
Yeah.
This episode is sponsored by InSport Education, the online business school for sport. They offer a range of different courses, for example, Foundations of Sport Business, Private Equity in Sport, and much, much more. As a listener to this podcast, you get 10% off all of their courses using the code SportsManagementPodcast10. Click the link in the description below and sign up today. You mentioned social media, and you have also done some work there, resolving Twitter disputes for Didi Hamann.
That was a long time ago. That was involving Didi Hamann and a footballer called Joey Barton, where Joey Barton said something that we objected to, and Joey Barton issued an apology. So I've dealt with several since then, but I work closely with our media and reputation management team, which again is an area which has grown quite significantly in recent years, and so we actually have a dedicated team for it now. It is something that I've dealt with in the past myself. So obviously, if somebody puts something on social media which you don't like, then the laws of defamation apply to that. The most recent Defamation Act in 2013 has made it more difficult to issue proceedings in relation to defamation matters. But where your sponsors and what have you, what I would do as a commercial sports lawyer is might do a sponsorship agreement which has a suite of rights. And in those rights, the sponsor will expect that person, if they've got 5 million followers or what have you, then they would expect them to put certain content on social media. Of course, as we all know, you can't stop people necessarily commenting on things like that or sharing it and then twisting it. So we need our reputation management people to get onto the platforms and contact the people and basically try and put right the misuse of these posts. So it's part and parcel, and it goes with being able to deal with clients that are basically just trying to exploit their rights through social media.
And I assume also that if we take a player who has a sponsorship contract, and if they write something that they shouldn't on social media, that can heavily impact all of their, sponsorships and so on.
Yeah, it would be very standard for a sponsored agreement to have a clause that said that neither party would bring the other into disrepute, or would bring the sport into disrepute, or would bring the sponsor into disrepute, or the club into disrepute. And they are fairly widely drafted. So something might happen that the player might not think actually brings the sponsor into disrepute, but if the way social media works, if it gains enough traction and so it blows up out of all proportion, then the sponsor might want to take a stand, and they might terminate the sponsorship agreement, but they may also try and make a virtue of it by saying not only we terminate the sponsorship agreement, but they make it known that they've terminated the sponsorship agreement to say we're taking a stand on this, which not only means that the player loses their sponsorship, but actually it causes them damage because the sponsor makes a big thing out of the fact that they've terminated the agreement. So as I say, the sponsorship agreements, the amount of money that a sponsor is prepared to pay will significantly increase if the player has a significant social media following, because it means, stating the obvious, but it means that the sponsor is reaching a bigger audience. But the bigger the audience, the more danger there is. And so effectively, the more safeguards and caveats you need to, as a lawyer, you need to make sure that are in there, so that if something happens that has a negative effect in the social media, that you've got the legal right to do something about it.
Did you hear about the shirt sponsor for the Danish soccer team now for the World Cup, that they did almost a transparent logo?
Yes.
Yeah, in that case, I've seen two sides of it. Some people think that it's great to take, distance from Qatar and what they represent. And on the other hand, it's more like a PR stunt. So it can also backfire, I think, sometimes, depending on how you present these type of things.
Well, we're talking about it, so I'm not sure it's backfired.
That's true.
My colleague, actually, Ben Pepe, who's a commercial specialist in the London office, has been commenting on this as well. So, as you say, if you're talking about PR and what have you, then you have commercial aspects of it. And at the end of the day, that's something for the PR teams to look at. Is this worth doing? Because it's going to get us a lot of PR. From a lawyer's point of view, that crosses over almost into sort of like ambush marketing type territory. One of the things we do deal with as lawyers is ambush marketing, where somebody is not an official sponsor of a particular event, but they try and have an association with that event in order to gain from that. So in some respects, the fact that you are announcing that you're changing your logo and what have you, you're doing it because you're taking a stand, but you also know that you're effectively going to be getting quite a bit of publicity out of it. And so the first couple of organizations that do this will get the publicity. The rest of them might do it because they're taking a stand, but they won't be doing it because of the publicity, because there won't be any, because somebody's already done it. So it'll be interesting to see if other sponsors do it, because if they are doing it, then they are doing it because they're genuinely taking a stand, because the shock value of it is dissipated now because somebody's already done it. So it'd be interesting to see who follows do. From a sponsor's point of view, from a technical point of view, it does raise some interesting questions, really, following on from what we've just been talking about, is with regard to what if the sponsor says, we want to do something with our logo, and the team say, no, you can't. It looks bad. We don't like it. So what if there's then a difference of opinion between the sponsor and the team? Then you'd have to look at the contract to see what the sponsor's rights were. And it might be that they've agreed a kit with a particular logo and what have you. And so if one of them tries to change it, then the other one might object to that, which is where the lawyers would then get involved. So if the national team and the sponsor are on the same page, then obviously it's not a problem, but you could potentially have disputes further down the line. And there have been some disputes in other areas with regard to sponsors wanting to do certain things with regard to their strips and what have you, and clubs wanting to do certain things with their strips to show support for certain causes, and there might be a difference of opinion with the actual kit manufacturers or the shirt sponsors who are affected by this. So that requires, firstly, obviously, dialogue, but secondly, for the lawyers to look at the contract.
That's definitely interesting. And you mentioned Ben Pepe, who is a previous guest also on this podcast.
So you saw Ben before me? Well, that puts me in my place, doesn't it? I'm always the bridesmaid, never mind.
No. And also with the ambush marketing, I've talked to Michael Payne from who used to work for IOC.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of interesting, legal parts of sports for sure.
Yeah, I think you hit a very good point there, Marcus, because as I say, if I was to sit in front of you and say, I know everything there is to know about every sport, then I'd be a liar. So, effectively, by your experience, you understand what you're expecting to come across in a contract, or you're expecting to come across in some regulations. And it means that you can perhaps find the answer quicker than if you haven't got that experience. But as I say, you effectively have to educate yourself with regard to where you need to look to find the answer. But you also, and you were talking about what advice would you give to a young lawyer? I think the other aspect of the advice as well is that sport lawyers cover a wide spectrum of the law, but it's dangerous if you try and overreach yourself. So I would never, for example, advise on a matrimonial matter or a property matter or something like that. And so you need to take a step back and say, what area of the law is this? It could be an intellectual property matter, and particularly when I'm dealing with sponsorship agreements and things like that. The intellectual property rights are very important, and it's a specialist area. And so it's important that you go to somebody who you get the advice from in that particular area. But with your understanding of the industry, then you will have an understanding of where to look. And I think that's also particularly important if you're an in-house lawyer as well, because if somebody comes to you with an issue, they want you to give them feedback fairly quickly on that problem. it's dangerous if you give an off-the-cuff response if you think you need to get specialist advice.
So when I'm getting married next year, I should not call you for help?
Certainly not in relation to the prenup, no.
Good to know. Looking back on your career, has there been any bumps on the road? And if so, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think you do get bumps in the road, because if you're in private practice, it's not like a normal job in many respects, because you're only working for the clients who provide you with work, or the law firm that provides you with work. If you're an in-house job, then you are simply paid for doing a particular job. So your workflow can increase and it can decrease. And obviously, your benefit to the firm that you're with increases and decreases. That's the reality of it. And so you may have to change firms. You may have to change location. You may have to take a job that you don't particularly want to take at the time, but all experience is invaluable in its own way. And so you can go down a dead end. You can join an organization and you think it's a brilliant in-house job, and then for whatever reason something happens with that organization and that organization goes out of business. And then particularly in sports, you can have broadcasting channels, you can have entities that spring up and then cease to exist. And so you do have to move about. Certainly to think that you're going to stay with the same job or same firm throughout your professional career is most unlikely. So, the bumps in the road are, for whatever reason, you may need to move and you may need to take something that doesn't seem to necessarily fit where you want to be. But as I say, all experience is helpful, and you will get to where you want to get to if you keep going.
That's good. Approaching the end of the interview, is there something that I haven't asked you that you want to bring up?
Well, one of my more interesting clients in the world of sport at the moment is Modest Golf Management, which is the company co-founded by pop star artist Niall Horan. I provide legal support to Modest Golf Management, who, as well as looking after players on a day-to-day basis, such as Tyrrell Hatton and Leona Maguire, Telly Kilder and Pierre Babnick and many others, they're also at the forefront of trying to advance golf to a younger demographic. So they're in partnership with the R&A and England Golf with regard to initiatives to arrange fun events and promote the game to younger people. I was at the Open Golf at St Andrews earlier this year, and Niall was very present there with regard to providing his time to help the R&A with initiatives with younger people there. All of that's very exciting. It's good that an agent, a manager is taking a proactive approach. They also get involved in promoting golf events at a more grassroots level, like the Rose Series for female professional golfers, and also the British Challenge, and also disability golf. They're involved quite heavily in relation to disability golf. So it's very good that somebody with such a high profile is doing something good for the game, as well as helping the established stars. Ultimately, hopefully, all of this will come out so that it advances the professional game. But as I say, my role is just to deal with commercial agreements and ambassador agreements and tournament agreements and the like. And for Modest and their players, such as Leona, as I say, with her sponsors and what have you. But I get to see how they create relationships, and it's all about the regulators and the sponsors and the players working together. And you would hope that somewhere down the line that might happen with Liv and the PGA and what have you, and it can actually come out as something that benefits the game, which I think is where quite a few of the more established professionals like John Rahm and what have you are trying to take it.
And if the listeners wants to follow Modest Golf, how can they do that? Will it be televised, or how can you follow that? Some
of the Modest Golf tournaments are televised. For example, the ISPS Handa event in Galgorm in Ireland last month. That was groundbreaking because that had a female event and a male event simultaneously. They weren't competing against each other, but they were playing on the same course. And you had one men's group and then one female group, and they were playing for similar prize money. And I visited that event last year and I thought it was fantastic. And the atmosphere was also great as well. And you got to see an awful lot of good golf, some very skillful golf. And those types of events are very good. And several other events that Modest promote are televised, but some of the events that are not on terrestrial television, there's an awful lot of good quality professional golf broadcast on YouTube now, streamed on YouTube, and certainly the highlights are on YouTube. So these type of events, I know the Rose Series is shown on Sky TV in England, and so if your local TV channel, wherever you are, doesn't show it, then you can go to YouTube and you will see these events being streamed there. Even Live Golf, for example, at the moment is streamed on YouTube, although it's not broadcast terrestrially. So there's an awful lot of good content on there.
The last question that I ask everyone is, if you could choose the next guest on this podcast, who do you think I should talk to?
Well, there's two people you could talk to. For example, you could talk to Mark McDonnell, who runs Modest Golf Management. As far as colleagues are concerned, just following on from what we're talking about, I've got a call this afternoon with my colleague Rebecca Young. Rebecca heads up our reputation management team. And as I say, that's a specialist area now. The big thing about players trying to help sponsors and attract followers on social media, reputation management is also a big thing now. And so you could probably talk to her about what she's doing in relation to helping sports people.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting, both of them. Thank you. Good names. Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Sports Management Podcast.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @sportsmpodcast.